Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
I'm Brandi Neal, writer and producer of the Radical Candor podcast.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. I do want to say I am recording this. I am at a goat farm. I spent the morning with some kids and goats. What I brought was my microphone. What I did not bring was my very special dongle. So if I sound a bit different today, that is the backstory, and we'll see if we have any friends join us for this podcast.
Goats, you mean?
Goats, chickens, goat friends.
Excellent.
On our last episode, we talked about the emotional and financial effects of layoffs on folks who've lost their jobs, and we shared our own personal stories. And now we're going to talk about what happens to the people left behind. So we want to explore a few different terms you may have been reading about or hearing about. These are quiet hiring, turnover contagion, and layoff survivor guilt. Jason, can you kick us off with a definition of quiet hiring?
Sure thing. Quiet hiring, which means, at least in this context, that those who've retained jobs after a layoff will be doing a lot more work because the work still needs to get done and the people who were doing it before are no longer there.
Kim, the second term, turnover contagion.
Turnover contagion is a phenomenon that occurs when an increased number of employees resign after a round of layoffs.
Thanks, Kim. And we're going to unpack each of these. The third one we're going to talk about is layoff survivor guilt, that feeling guilty to still be working for an organization that just conducted a mass layoff. And in addition, folks that are left behind are also might be fearful that they're going to be next. So this means that managers really need to prioritize rebuilding trust with their employees after a layoff. Let's go back to quiet hiring. And Kim, Jason, in the past, this practice has been compared to promoting from within. In this current landscape, some companies are framing quiet hiring as a path to upskilling and career advancement, but many employees are experiencing it as being tricked into doing undesirable work for little or no rewards. What do you think?
So there's a bad way to look at this, and then there's a positive way to look at this. And there's a bad reality and a positive reality. The bad reality is all of a sudden you have more work and you're doing new types of work that you don't like to do and that you didn't sign up to do, and you're not getting paid any extra for all this. It's like getting a promotion but not getting any pay bump. And that is not what you signed up for. So what can you do about it if you're the employee, and what can you do about it if you're the manager? So I'm going to describe an ideal world with the acknowledgement that this world is not ideal. But in an ideal world, managers and employees would sit down together and use this as an opportunity to look at all the work the team was doing and to figure out what work you can eliminate, what work you can automate, and what work you can sort of hire someone else to do offshore or do it in, sort of outsource. And I did this at one point, not as a result of a round of layoffs, but actually because the work was so boring. I was managing a customer support team at Google, and at first I was, I came in, trying to tell everybody what to do, and I realized that everybody was going to quit if I just told them what to do. And so I sat down. I was like, okay, you all, are not that happy with your jobs. What can we do to refactor things so that you'll be happier? And that had great results. We grew, and the size of the team didn't grow, and the work that people did got a lot more interesting. So it's possible to use this as an opportunity. Amy, it looks like you want to say something.
Yeah, I'm really curious. I don't know if you can remember, but just to unpack that moment where you come in and you're noticing people aren't that happy, were there certain actions, behaviors, what you took ultimately as an opportunity? What were the signals?
Well, a bunch of people left my team and quit and joined other teams. I realized that I was going to have to do something else, or I wasn't going to have a lot of people working for me. But I think, if you want to try to figure out how to know that people are unhappy, just ask them. I mean, just say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy are you with what you are doing? Are there things that you wish you could be doing that you're not doing? Like, how happy are you in your job? I mean, very often just asking people if they're happy in their job is a great place to start. And, sometimes people will tell you, sometimes you'll have to pick up on signals. But if you practice radical candor and rewarding the candor, then people will often tell you. It's a reason why soliciting feedback is such an important thing for managers to do. Now, what do you do if your world is not the ideal world that I just talked about, and your manager is not open to that? If your manager's in, what was the thing from the movie, the TPF sheets or whatever, the grunt work?
TPS reports.
TPS reports. Like there's a bunch of grunt work that's unnecessary that somebody else used to do, and now your manager is insisting that you do it. You can still use this moment as an opportunity to figure out if there are other roles that you might enjoy. Try some new things. And if you're still sort of overburdened with grunt work, it's time to polish up the old resume. Yes, layoffs are happening. Yes, it's scary to be looking right now, but the hiring market is still strong. The other thing I would say, not too long ago, I was at a farmer's market and I walked by a kombucha table. And I noticed that behind the table was a woman who used to work on my team at Google. And she had left Google and started a kombucha company. And she was so much happier. Another person I bumped into started a tea shop. And recently I was unfortunately at a funeral. And another person who used to work on my team at Google now works in landscaping. And all these people are so much happier. So use this as an opportunity to sort of explore, to cast the net broadly and explore. Now, what if you're a manager and you're hoping that your team doesn't leave to start tea shops and kombucha companies? This is a moment for you to double down on career conversations. Figure out who wants to do what. Help people use this moment as an opportunity to take a step in the direction of their dreams. Build some skills that are going to help them move in the direction that they want to go. Am I being too up in the air about this?
Well, I'm curious, like with the career conversations, any specific tips? And Jason, you might have some perspectives as the manager, if the priorities that you need to accomplish don't actually relate to the types of work that would take the person into their tea shop or their kombucha shop. Like, how do you thread that needle for your priorities and their goals?
Yeah, before Jason jumps in, can I tell a story I've told before? Because I think it's relevant here.
Yes.
And then Jason, I promise I'll shut up and let you talk.
He's just drinking some kombucha in the background.
At tea, probably. So in career conversations in the book, and I think we've talked on this podcast about this before, but one of my favorite stories about career conversations comes from Russ Laraway having a conversation with a woman on his team about what her dreams were. So remember, career conversations, you talk about someone's past, then you talk about their dreams, so the past, the future, and then you talk about what are the skills that you need to take a step in the direction of those dreams. And one of the dreams, Russ was leading a team that was selling double-click ad servers. And a woman on his team had a dream of owning and operating a spirulina farm. Spirulina is a high-protein algae. So that seemed pretty far afield. Her dream and her reality, at first blush, seemed to have nothing to do with one another. But Russ he's very creative in the way he thinks about these things. And he said, okay, what I want to do is think about what are the skills that you need? So in the third conversation, after the dreams conversation, what are the skills you need to take a step in the direction of this spirulina farm? And one of the skills she was going to need to have was to learn how to manage a group of people. And what she had been doing was a lot of analytics work. And one of the things that Russ needed someone to do is to manage a big team. So he said, okay, we're going to take you off those analytics projects, put you on this team where you're managing a big group of people, and we'll give the analytics project to someone else who's more interested in analytics. And it turns out, like, when you have a lot of work and fewer people to do it, you do have the opportunity to shift the work around in a way that better suits what people actually want to do, what people actually want to learn.
I was only going to say that I think the moment that we find ourselves in presents opportunities for companies and managers in particular, especially direct managers, to invest more deeply in the development of the people who remain on their team. I think one of the best ways to retain people, even though you're going through a period of quiet hiring, is such a terrible name for this. I know this is a slight detour, but can I just say that when I see the term quiet hiring, I do not think of essentially loading people up with a bunch of work that they don't really want to do. But I understand the intent, which is to compare it to quiet quitting, which is the other phenomenon that we talked about recently on the podcast. But like from my perspective, if you're going to ask people to do more and you can't pay them more, then the one thing that you can do for them is to provide them opportunities to learn. That is the one thing that you can do. It doesn't cost the company a lot of money and may, in fact, wind up being, I think there are a lot of win-win situations to be derived from giving people the opportunity to try different things, especially in the context of not having enough hands to do all the work.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I also think it's important to realize that sometimes we were doing work that was not necessary. There was another moment again, I'm sorry, all these examples are coming up for me from Google. There was an engineer who I worked with at Google. There was a team of people approving ads. And before an ad ever ran, it had to be approved by a human being. And this engineer said, what if we only approve the ads that have run, 1 or 2 page views, you didn't want it to run. And that decreased the workload like by a factor of 10, just that one idea. And so get creative. And if you're the manager, you do not know where these ideas are going to come from. They're probably not going to come from you. This is your opportunity to really listen to what your team tells you and to create incentives for them to come up with these ideas. And the incentives are not going to be financial because you don't have money. That's your whole problem. The incentives have got to be about helping people take a step in the direction of the dreams, helping people grow, helping people do more interesting work. There's a company that Jason and I have been working with called Joyous, and it pulls a lot of these ideas out of people. Jason, you want to explain how it works?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I think about it is it's a set of surveys, but instead of the survey responses going into some amorphous data collection bucket, they take a human being. And so you might ask a survey question, and then the expectation is that a human being looks at the responses to those survey questions and is going to follow up on the responses that they determine they think need a response. It also collects all the data so you can run statistical analyses and all kinds of other interesting data crunching on it. But that step is the essential part. In my mind, what it really helps you do is to pay attention at scale to the things that are on people's minds. And to me, it seems like it's when you're find yourself in a situation where work is being redistributed, that's a really important moment to make sure that you're checking in with people to find out what's on their mind. And Kim, I really want to underscore what you said, which is I said that the one thing you can do for them is help them learn. But the other thing that you can do for them is commit to reducing any unnecessary work that is being done on the team. I think that second commitment is essential, because if you're going to load up people's plates, you should spend at least as much effort trying to figure out what you can stop doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one of my favorite examples from Joyous is they were working with a big telecommunications company. And so they asked people, what was irritating in their day. And there were a bunch of people who went out and repaired like lines and telecommunication lines, climbed up poles and repaired lines. And there was one particular wrench that was never in the truck. And so people would go and then they would realize they would need the wrench and then they'd have to go back. And so it was inefficient for the company. It was a waste of money. But there's nothing more frustrating than doing work that they're wasting your time. People don't like to waste their time, as it turns out. And companies shouldn't like for their people to waste time. And so they put the wrench in the truck and everybody was happier and the company saved a lot of money. And so those are the kinds of things. But what had happened before Joyous was that people would complain about it and the individual managers wouldn't do anything about these complaints because they didn't realize what a problem it was until they had this system. So that's the kind of thing that I think companies can do. And everybody should go out and use Joyous, but if you don't have the money for Joyous, just listening is free and acting on the feedback that you're getting from people. What's irritating in their day, and try to eliminate those irritations. Don't tell people to suck it up, because they will not suck it up. They will quit.
Yeah, I really appreciate the conversation. And just to highlight a couple things that I heard, Jason, you had really been talking about the importance of, if you don't have additional resources financially to support people, just to really support the development. And Kim, these different ideas of how can you identify pain points, both through listening one-on-one, using technological tools like Joyous on a more scale level. I guess the one time that throwing a wrench in things really doesn't throw a wrench in things. So that's a good love a paradox. Brandi, just to bring us back to quiet hiring, acknowledging that Jason noted that was not a great name. It feels actually quite euphemistic for what might be on the other end. It sounded like you had a story you wanted to share. And if you have a better title for the phrase of quiet hiring based on your story, we're all ears.
It's quiet dumping the work, or quiet doubling your work.
Yeah, it is like a dumping of the work. Thanks, Amy. I did just want to mention about the career conversations that if you are the manager, I think it's important to be explicit with your team members that you actually want to know these things and you're not going to use it against them. Because I was on a team once where a new manager came in, had these conversations with everybody, and then used them against us as why we weren't right for our jobs, or why I ended up resigning shortly after that. But because of that experience,
that is
I am
really
probably
good.
always going to tell you what you want to hear unless you reassure me that you're not trying to trick me in some way.
Yeah, that is a really important point.
I've had a similar experience, and I think it does go to trust. And I'm glad you brought that up, Brandi. We'll get back to the quiet or not so quiet dumping of additional work. When it comes to those career conversations, one thing I think we talked about recently was actually saying that that's what you're doing. Kim, I think you had shared a story about someone's like, I've been talking to them about their career, and people didn't know that that was happening. But I do think that trust and feeling like it's not, well, I'm just taking you a step in your direction of your dreams. It happens to be not in this job. So bye-bye is a really important piece. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yes. So back to the quiet dumping of work. I told a story, I think, on the last episode about rage applying. And so I'm at the company that I rage applied to at the newspaper. This is 2007. And the publisher gathered us all in the break room after the paper went to press and said he had sold the company, and he had sold the company to the company I had left. There were about 10 of us who had come over from this other paper. So now we're back working for the company we all escaped from. And then 2008 comes, which is the Great Recession, the crash of newspapers. Print newspapers just couldn't figure out how to put their content online and still make money, and the rise of online news sites. So it was a big debacle. People started getting laid off. They laid off our receptionist, our news assistant, and then we get into like the turnover contagion. People who resigned were not replaced. We had in the editorial department no manager at all. We had no idea who we worked for. So there were 4 editors, and we had 6 newspapers we had to put out weekly, and we got together and we're like, how are we going to do this? And we restructured our team in a way that we would each be responsible for more than one paper. And that went pretty well for a while. But then my partner was laid off from his photojournalism job. So we lived in Maine at the time. And if anyone is familiar with Maine, we'd say there's like one job for every person, and they keep it for the rest of their lives because you'll never get another one in your field. So we didn't know if we were going to be able to stay in Maine. And we moved to a winter rental that only had a space heater. It's like 10 degrees outside, we're freezing. In the meantime, I'm doing all this extra work. I'm reporting, I'm paginating, I'm typing up letters to the editor, I'm answering the phone, I'm monitoring 4 email accounts, I'm editing stories from 4 different reporters. And I started to get so overwhelmed that I wanted to put this really obnoxiously aggressive notice in the paper about how people could submit content for the calendar letters to the editor. And it was like, you cannot do this, no PDFs, nothing handwritten, it has to be emailed. And the other editors came to me, they're like, you cannot put this in the paper. And that's when I knew it was time to resign. But what actually pushed me over the edge was doing a special section for a town's 350th anniversary, Scarborough, Amy, where you used to go in the summer. And I'm like, I cannot take on one more piece of extra work. So I resigned and ended up going over to corporate marketing, which we call the dark side in journalism.
And you've been there ever since.
Been here ever since. But I mean, I still do some writing, but that was the end of my days as a daily newspaper person. And it was extremely stressful and demoralizing. Also, when I resigned, I didn't even know who to resign to because we didn't have a manager. So that was a little weird also.
I think Brandi brought up something that we didn't talk about that is really important in her story, which is that very often when people are in an environment where there have been a bunch of layoffs and one partner is laid off and the other isn't, and all of a sudden you're having to move into a place where there's a space heater and not a proper heat, that creates so much stress for folks. And I think it's really important that you had, it would have been great if there had been a manager for you to talk to about this, Brandi. But it's really important to be aware of the extra stressors that are on people financially in these moments and figure out, what you can do to help as the manager. There was one employee I had who was living in this sort of horrible place. And he was going to quit because he hated where he was living. And I knew that he was so stressed out that he couldn't understand why he was about to quit. And I actually I love doing this. This is one of my weird obsessions. But I spent an afternoon looking on Craigslist for places where he could live that would fit within his budget. And he told me much later, he said, that was the reason I didn't quit. You figured it out. And sometimes when you're in the heat of the stress, you can't, I think I left New York because I hated my apartment.
So the one thing I wanted to add was with a job too, like journalism, where your name is on it, if I'm putting my name on this, especially in a small community where people are coming up to you at the grocery store, people are coming into the office either to yell at you or to tell you they liked something that you did, there's really not an option to not do all that extra work, which is why I resigned, because I was worried I was going to make a mistake or miss something that was going to get us sued. And I did not want that responsibility.
Yeah. Okay, managers out there, don't do your folks.
Beyond the layoffs, I feel like there was just a complete failure of leadership in the newspaper. Essentially, I think destined them to fail, at least to fall further. And I do think that in some ways, your story illustrates how important it is that someone step up. The group of you stepped up to figure out how to edit the 6 papers, for example. My sense is that some of the narrative when it comes to layoffs is oh, there's nothing we can do. Managers are saying, oh, there's nothing we can do. We're powerless. But a single manager could have made a huge difference to the group of editors. It could have meant an entirely different career trajectory for you if someone had stepped up into that position and actually offered you management and guidance. So as horrible as that story is, to me, it speaks to the power of people doing the job of management. Sometimes it can feel very hopeless and you can feel quite powerless, but you may not find out till much later that some small thing you did was the reason why someone didn't quit. Yeah. And that can make it worth it.
So, Brandi, you also mentioned this idea of turnover contagion, where people who don't necessarily want to take on new roles or do more work are more likely to resign after a mass layoff. And they might, be craving what Jason is talking about, some leadership. someone who's going to take on these managerial roles. According to a report from Visier, a human resources analytics company, quote, there is a contagion effect inside teams when people are asked to leave involuntarily. Some of their peers are more likely to resign in response. After one person's termination of employment, the likelihood of their team members resigning increases by 7.7%, end quote. So this means that organizations that don't take turnover contagion into account when they're planning layoffs, they actually end up letting too many people go. They've now got extra folks leaving as well. Kim, you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple of things. One is you're much more likely to have layoff contagion when you handle it badly than when you handle it well. So I would say it's a little bit unpredictable what will happen. But I think that if you handle a layoff very well, you will have less contagion. And then if you handle the redistribution of the work poorly after a layoff, you're going to have layoff contagion because you're all of a sudden people are in jobs that they hate where they used to maybe like their job. And, this whole notion of layoff contagion is bringing up for me is a story early in my career. I was working at a tech startup that did some layoffs. And I had a lot of survivor guilt. And I quit shortly after the layoffs. And I quit to write a novel, by the way. So it was actually an important career transition for me. But one of the important things that happened was that one of the people who had been laid off urged me not to leave too soon. He said, don't quit until you vest and get your money so that you can do what you want next, which is to write. And so I will say a couple of things about layoff guilt. One, staying in touch with the people who've been laid off can be very helpful, and both at a practical level and helpful to you as well as helpful to them. So don't imagine that if you're staying in touch with people who've laid off, like you're doing them a favor. They may be doing you a favor. So I think that's important a thing to think about. Jason, what do you think?
On the topic of like the turnover contagion piece, I think I don't want to widen the lens too much, but this is exactly why layoffs should be an absolute last resort. I don't want to trivialize the layoffs. As we were talking about this, I started to think about Netflix changing its policy on sharing passwords. And the thing that those two policy shifts, it makes you think about your job, right? So like the layoffs cause you to think about your job because you're like, well, I could be next, right? Like there's clearly no loyalty. They laid off that person who's been here for 20 years and they were a senior manager and I'm just, engineer number 37 over here. So I think it's totally unsurprising to me that companies wind up overlaying off people because they don't think about that. But I don't think that the solution is never make people think about their job. I think the solution is to like create an environment where people actually like their job and see a future for themselves. Mm-hmm. But in my mind, when you inject the uncertainty of a layoff, you have to anticipate this contagion, which means going back to what we were talking about with quiet hiring is reinvesting in the relationships that you have with the people on your team. If you're a manager or an individual contributor, like spend time investing in those relationships, focus on development and focus on eliminating busy work. Like otherwise, Kim, to your point, you're going to wind up that contagion is likely going to spread. And the most recent public example that we have of this is Twitter, who announced they laid off half the company. And then they had another moment where they said, well, we're going to be really hardcore now. So anybody who doesn't want to stick around for hardcore Twitter 2.0, you can, don't let the door hit you on the way out. And they lost another 1,200 employees. And I think there's a relationship between these things, but this is conjecture. They've also had some fairly high-profile outages recently. So I think Twitter is feeling the strain of losing 60% plus of its workforce over the course of a couple of months. So, for people out there who are considering layoffs, I think for both of these reasons that we just talked about, how hard it is, summing up to how hard it is to retain people, even the ones that you don't fire during a layoff, like consider every other option available to you before you do it.
Totally. Yeah. And if you do decide you have to do it, do it. Don't be an asshole about it.
Yeah, I think, what we're painting a picture of is that there's a lot of ramifications, ripple effects unintended consequences. And, Kim, you started talking about layoff survivor guilt, the importance of staying in touch. Catherine Morgan, who's the author of This Isn't Working, Evolving the Way We Work to Decrease Stress, Anxiety, and Depression, said, quote, I was talking with a client about the, quote, survivor guilt she felt having made it through a big round of layoffs. It's an unnerving and heartbreaking experience. Even if you still have your job, you feel untethered and you can smell the fear. Kim, you spoke a little bit about that, but I'd love to connect with you and Jason on how managers can rebuild trust with their teams, especially if you yourself might not be feeling trust towards the organization based on what you just went through.
Yeah, I mean, this moment is such an important moment if you're a manager, because the way that you treat people determines whether you're going to get their best effort, a perfunctory effort, or whether they're going to just try to sabotage you. And when you treat people like cogs in a machine, you're not going to get any more than you demand. And in fact, you create an incentive to break the machine. And yet, it happens so often that people, when they are managers in a stressful situation, which a layoff certainly is, they start to imagine that people are just their pawns on a chessboard. And they start to have this attitude that you are lucky to have your job still, so I can do whatever I want to you and you're not going to quit. And that is just not the way it is, especially in this environment. I mean, there are still a lot of people who are hiring out there despite these layoffs. So just because there was a round of layoffs does not mean that people are willing to pay the asshole tax. They are not. So don't treat people like pawns on a chessboard. At Juice, at the startup that I did in New York after 9/11, we had to do layoffs and I didn't handle it as well as I should have. And then I became just totally transparent with everybody. And I was surprised. I mean, I told everyone pretty clearly, this is a sinking ship. If you can, at some point, I was like, if you can get another job, you should go get it. And a lot of people didn't. They said, nope, we're going to stick with this until the end. And I think that was in part a result of the transparency. People really cared about shutting this thing down. Well, we sold it, sell being a generous term for what actually happened. But people really wanted this thing to have a soft landing. And even some of the people who, there was one person who got laid off and he decided to move back home, to move across the country back home. And there was a bunch of stuff he couldn't take. And he gave me his bicycle. I was like, why are you giving me your bicycle? Because you have to move home because you were just laid off. But we were just open with each other and we kept in touch. And we did not allow this situation that we were going through together to rob us of our humanity. And I think that was important.
I think that's such a great story. And Kim, as you're sharing, I was thinking of, we have this phrase, turnover contagion. And what you're describing is kind of transparency and compassion, dare I say, radical candor contagion. And that by you modeling that, it's you're I'm going to sort of tell you how it is. And I think that really inspired a lot of trust and reciprocity. Jason, I want to put you in a bit of a potential role play situation. I was recently working with a group of managers, and they have now inherited some new direct reports because those folks, managers, were laid off. And so imagine, if you will, go back in time. It's 2008, 2009, and you are a manager at a small newspaper in chilly Maine, and you've got Brandi as one of your new editors. And mindful that this might not be your industry, how would you approach that situation with a new direct report who might be a little skeptical based on sort of the traumatic experience they've been through?
I'm just speaking for myself, and this is the way my mind works in those moments. The first thing that I want to do is to have sort of a hopes and dreams, a fears and dreams conversation. What are you most worried is going to happen, and what do you hope would happen? And that would be for all my team members. I wouldn't just do that with the new team members. I'd be talking to all my team members to say hey, we just went through this big transition. I need to know what's on your mind. What are you afraid of? What's keeping you up at night? And what are your sort of hopes and dreams? What do you wish would happen? If we could wave a magic wand, this is a moment where things are going to change. And so we might as well have some intention about how they change. And I think my guess is a lot of what I would get are questions about the fear is like, are more layoffs coming? Is my job safe? Like those kinds of things. And I think the really tough part about being a manager in these situations is often you don't know. You just don't know if more layoffs are coming. You can't promise that they're not. You're, as much as the employee was the last person to be told, you were the second to last person to be told. You know what I'm saying? So like, it's not as though you have some magic knowledge of what's happening during a layoff.
Even if you're the decider, you don't know. You know, like the economic situation could be very dynamic.
Correct. As a coach to many people who work in startups, like there's often these moments where you're going out to do a fundraise, for example, and you go out with a firm belief that you're going to be able to raise enough money for your company to keep it running and grow it over the next couple of years. But the reality of the market when you go out to fundraise is like, you can't do that. Not only can you not make it grow, you're going to have to make it shrink if you want it to survive. And so layoffs become a thing where they can appear without a ton of warning. I feel like most people feel like the big tech companies had a lot of warning. They sort of overhired. They should have known that they were doing this. But that's not always the situation. But all of that being said, what I would commit to my team members is I will tell you what I know and I will tell you what I don't know. I will be very clear with you about what I know and what I don't know. And I commit to you to doing everything I can to finding answers, but there may be some things that I just won't know. And so what I would like to do is focus on the things that are in our control to make this the best of this situation. And that's why the hopes and fears conversation. So beyond, will there be more layoffs? What are the things that are bugging you? Kim, I liked your question. Like, what's annoying about the work that you're doing today? What are you afraid is going to happen? What would you like to happen? And I think doing a couple of small things to show that you can make things better, that it's not just about delaying sort of the inevitable doom, but in fact, even in this situation, things can get better, goes a long way when you combine it with transparent communication about what's known and unknown.
I so appreciate that. I'm curious, Brandi, if Jason led with that fears and hopes check-in, how would that have landed for you?
Yeah, I think if I trusted Jason, I think that I would have been receptive to that. I also knew that they weren't going to get rid of me because I was who was going to put out the paper. You know, I felt like I was able to speak up. There was just nobody listening. You know, like we were literally in a basement and then the advertising and business staff was on the first floor. Nobody ever came down to talk to us. And the news didn't make money per se. Like newspapers are supported by advertising, and then you have what's called the news hole. So as the advertisers went away, like the news hole is getting bigger and bigger, which means like we need to put more news in the paper, but the paper's not making money. So we were really not considered valuable at all. They're like, anyone can just fill the paper with things, but it would have been great to have somebody that I felt like was on our side and cared about our staff. And I think all of us, all the 4 editors who were there at that time, one person is still there. She's running everything. The rest of us have all gone into corporate marketing and copywriting and online tech things.
Well, I appreciate you sharing the story. I think a lot of people can relate. And I think just what Jason shared about the value of management and empathy and listening, and also someone there to actually hear what you have to say. Before we close, I want to just bring up Kim and Jason, something that's on my mind. Jason, when you're talking about transparent communication and coaching founders who are fundraising, how do you coach those founders who might feel completely freaked out that they're not going to get the money? They're very worried. How do you lead a team at the same time you might have some real fears about the financial future? How do you balance transparency, vulnerability, and leadership?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that it depends on whether or not the fear is real, meaning like there's real evidence to support that fear is going to come true, versus neurotic fear, which is like, the market is terrible. We haven't even started fundraising, but I'm worried that we're not going to be able to raise the money. That's very different than we've made 4 pitches and it's become very clear that we're not going to raise the money. And that's the point at which I would encourage a leader to think about how they communicate this to their team, to say, and who on their team they start communicating this to. But I think you have to be really intentional, because until it is known that you're not going to raise the money and you're going to have to take on cost-cutting measures, I think that's a very scary thing to say that it might happen. And it can cause a bunch of neurotic fear for everybody. So once you realize that you are in that potential future where you're going to have to do cost cutting, then I think you have an obligation, if you want to do right by people, to communicate it.
I mean, very specifically, the thing when I was at Juice that I shared with people was I got the controller to share the budget, like how much money we had in the bank and what our burn rate was and when we were going to run out of money. And I shared my calendar with people and I let them know how many pitches I was doing. And like by the time I was on my 68th pitch and we hadn't raised money, I didn't have to, like, I shared the facts. I tried not to share my fears because I was trying to like put my fears to the side and keep my head down and keep fundraising. But I let people know the facts. Like we've gotten 68 rejections and I have, 8 more meetings planned. And people are like, shit, Kim has a terrible job. I appreciate that she's doing it. I think that, because it's no fun to like get that many rejections.
Where did you, if I'm hearing you were sharing the facts, not the fears. Where were you going to share the fears?
Well, I had a therapist, I buried a lot of them in the bottle. I can't say I handled it perfectly, but I didn't want to impose my fears on the rest of the team. Yeah, I did want to share the facts.
I think it's a really huge point. Maybe we can bring it up in another conversation because that balance of being vulnerable, being authentic to yourself while not freaking out the team. And it sounds like you did that balance, probably optimizing more for the safety of the team than potentially yourself. But I think it clearly paid off in how much they felt you cared and the trust you built. So with that, shall we move on to our tips?
Let's do it.
All right. So tip number 1 of our Radical Candor checklist. If you suddenly find yourself experiencing quiet hiring, or what we have renamed as loud dumping of additional work, talk to your manager about how you can leverage your new responsibilities towards your professional development goals. And when, again, managers listening to this, please leverage that ability to develop your team members. It's also appropriate for your team members to ask you how you'll be compensated for doing additional work.
Tip number 2, when you do have information that affects your team, when you have facts, commit to delivering facts as soon as possible in a way that's kind and clear. Make sure that you're allowing people who are left behind after a layoff to ask questions and provide them answers if you have them. If you don't have answers, it's okay to admit that you don't know, but be clear how and when you are going to deliver relevant news to them in the future and to deliver it as soon as possible.
Tip number 3, if you are a manager, have very intentional career conversations with each person on your team. Let them know that you're doing this in good faith and not to use it against them. You don't want this job? Well, I'm going to fire you then. That's not a good career conversation. And use these career conversations to figure out the best way to redistribute the work rather than just dumping work on people or acting as though people are your pawns on your chessboard.
So for more tips, go to radicalcandor.com/resources. Download our learning guides for practicing radical candor. You can find the show notes for this episode at radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. If there's a career topic you'd like for us to discuss, you can email us, podcast @radicalcandor.com. Finally, there is, of course, Radical Candor swag. You can go to radicalcandor.com for the shop link where you find coffee mugs and magnets and notepads. Maybe we need to add kombucha and tea and goat milk and all these other things where people are living out their dreams. Bye for now. Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandi Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.